Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from this, my little humble nutshell of infinite space, my television studio apartment right here in the Wood of the Holly, under the sign, overlooking the COVID-addled but still enchanting land of law. And today, folks, my heart's palpitating because I have a very special guest. This man is at the vanguard of the contemporary Catholic social justice tradition, and that includes important figures like Dorothy Day, Daniel and Philip Berrigan, Thomas Burton, Mother Teresa. He's worked with non-Catholic spiritual leaders and non-violent advocates like Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, and special person for me, James Lawson. And where I have lived in the safety of research and theory, this gentleman has lived in the danger of practice. He's been living the life, walking the walk, talking the talk. He's been arrested over 80 times, jailed countless more. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which I hope to talk about. He's a prolific author. I recently read his book, Living Peace. I am humbled to have you with me across this slender digital divide, speaking to me from the Beatitude Center on the gorgeous central coast of California. Welcome, the one, the only Father John Deere, and from this point forward, you're John. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Bill. It's nice to be here with you.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Happy to talk about nonviolence with you.
Now, firstly, and we just spoke about this briefly, I want to thank you for the movie recommendation. I just saw A Hidden Life about Franz Jägerstätter, who was a conscientious objector in Austria during World War II, recently was beatified. I saw the Terrence Malick movie. I was blown away, and you have a very personal history with this gentleman.
I hope people will go and watch it, because to me, he's one of the greatest people of the century. One of the only people in all of Austria, when the Nazis rolled in, who refused to become a Nazi. Hitler was so shocked. They brought him to Berlin and put him on trial in Hitler's personal court, and he was beheaded. And I became close with his family, his wife, who just died at age 100. And she's just one of the greatest people I ever met. And everybody should see that movie. It's a Terrence Malick masterpiece. Thank you, Terrence Malick, for doing it.
Yeah, I thought when I saw it, I was waiting to see the Von Trapp family come running out with Julie Andrews. It was so...
This is not The Sound of Music. It's nicer looking in some ways, but it's scarier because he doesn't flee. He resists Hitler and says, go ahead and kill me, and they kill him. This is why it's a gospel story, and we all need to watch it and deal with it. And Terrence Malick only he could do such a beautiful job on it. But it's hard, and so is the gospel, and so is life. But this guy, Franz Jägerstätter, is a 1 in a billion hero. He basically said, in the face of the Nazis, what can you do? Well, maybe all you can offer the world is the example of going to your death without supporting war or taking up the gun. Everybody else took up the gun, and they all went. All his friends who were rounded up ended up on the Russian front and were killed before he was. He actually lived longer than his friends.
What struck me about the movie is that how he came to this understanding. He didn't have the benefit of an education. He wasn't studied in the church. As you mentioned seconds ago, he was a little bit of a wild man in his earlier days. But yet he took these instructions, the instructions from Jesus, quite literally. That he couldn't deviate from them. It's not something that requires like a master's degree. That's one of the things that hit me hard.
Well, in fact, I think a master's degree does a lot of harm. I'll intellectualize our way around the gospel so that we don't have to do anything. The point is to stand up and to work to end war, nuclear weapons, poverty, racism, executions. You got to do something, not read about it or study it. But Franz is there in the countryside of Austria with a spectacular wife, Franziska, my friend, and all he's got is the Gospels, and he reads the Sermon on the Mount seriously. By the way, the person who read the Sermon on the Mount more than any other person on the planet is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount every morning and every evening for 45 years, and he's not even a Christian. And there in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil, and love your enemies." And Franz is going, "Well, Hitler, I'd love to kill for you, but I got this guy, Jesus. What can I do?" And then kill him. And he's in heaven, and we got to get with the program. Franz just said, I'm going to obey. I'm going to be as nonviolent as Jesus and let the chips fall where they may. We know now, 80 years later, that he was right, that violence doesn't work. Hitler may have lost the war, but the Cold War began, and we've been on the verge of nuclear destruction ever since. We're more entrenched in violence than ever. Franz was right. Nonviolence is the only hope, and he figured it out just from the Gospels. We've got Mahatma Gandhi, my heroes here, Dr. King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Dorothy Day. We've got so many great heroes and teachings, and so much proof of the power of organized grassroots nonviolence. Besides, who wants to have a gun and kill people and be in the army? Those days are over. My message, Bill, is tell everybody to quit the military, not to send their kids to the military, get rid of their guns, and work to abolish war, nuclear weapons, and all violence. There, that's my speech.
Well, one thing that really intrigued me in my own research and then reading your stuff is this incredible intellectual tradition. Actually, I kind of want to dial it back a little bit before Jesus to Moses, because I always felt like the Exodus story, when you look at it, without all the hocus pocus, is about making a demand, getting organized, and refusing to cooperate in your own enslavement and hitting the road. And I go, well, wait, that's the first nonviolent liberation story. And, then you got, at least in the continuum that I've imagined, I see Jesus and then American abolitionists and the Quaker movement and Tolstoy and Gandhi and Lawson and King. So this whole slender thread across the millennia to me was so interesting when I was starting to dive into it.
That's actually absolutely correct. And I think about that all the time. I call it the lineage of nonviolence. And this is what the spiritual life is supposed to be about and what the political life is supposed to be about. And you're totally fine and right about Moses. Actually, the first civil disobedience in the Bible is the women who, put Moses, the baby, in the basket and put him down the river. And there was breaking the laws left and right. But you could go back in the history of civil disobedience to the Greeks and all that. It's all spectacular. But anyway, because Jesus talks about the lineage of nonviolence, you got Moses, that leads up to the prophets, especially Daniel. They're doing nonviolent resistance. And Jesus, to me, being the epitome of nonviolence in history. And everything he did was illegal and civilly disobedient. And in the first 3 centuries of the church, if you were baptized, you got beheaded because you're saying our guy's God and we're not joining the Roman army. Well, a couple of centuries after that, they got rid of that and threw out the Sermon on the Mount. Next thing you know, Christians are horrible and waging war. And the movement of nonviolence went underground. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, then the early monastic movement, then St. Francis and St. Clare. And then you're right, Quakers, the Anabaptists, the Mennonites. And all of this led to the abolitionists. And then you have the suffragettes, and then the labor movement, and then the civil rights movement. You have Gandhi, Dr. King, and Dorothy Day. And after the assassination of Dr. King, as Jim Lawson and I have talked many times, there's been an explosion of nonviolent movements around the world. 2/3 of the human race right now is personally involved in grassroots movement of nonviolence. And the big ones are the women's movement, the environmental movement. Well, it could go on. And there have been 100 nonviolent revolutions in the last 50 years. This is the hope of the planet, is to join that lineage and to help bring about positive social change through bottom-up, people-power grassroots movements, from Jesus to Gandhi to Greta, the environmental movement, and Jane Fonda and the Fire Drill Fridays, which I'm part of. This is how change happens. This is where the action is. And by the way, my point has always been, this is the spiritual life. Because if you're nonviolent, you need God. But if you're violent, you got guns and money, who needs God?
Right.
It doesn't work. You end up killing people and getting killed and wasting your life.
One of the things that struck me when I was listening to your podcast, which I totally recommend, as I imagine it dramatically, was that moment when Jesus breaks this tradition, this Old Testament tradition, which probably had preceded him for thousands of years, or he challenges it, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He goes, no, we're going to love our enemies. Like, that moment must have been like, this guy is wackadoodle. What the hell? I mean, the revolutionary assertion of that idea at that moment, but we still really haven't come to terms with it. I mean, all you got to do is drive down Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, where I live, and there's always a movie poster with some $200 million movie star with an AR-15 or a handgun, and basically that's an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth. I've been screwed. I'm getting my revenge. Come watch. It's a movie. And so, like, that moment, that it just seems like so incredibly revolutionary, such a departure from the past.
Yeah, it's been completely rejected, basically, in 2,000 years, because here we are on the brink of, we're in permanent warfare, but catastrophic climate change, 4 billion people in poverty, which is just sowing the roots for war, but 15,000 nuclear weapons, enough to blow the planet over 15 times. Christians are the problem, Bill, because we've all rejected that nonviolence of Jesus. It's like saying, I'm a follower of Gandhi, but I build nuclear weapons and I have my AK-47, as if Gandhi did that. It's all, Jesus was a good Jewish boy too, Bill, but he was totally into nonviolence. And he got it from your Hebrew scriptures, because you see it there. He's saying, Moses tried to teach you all, and he said, okay, an eye for an eye. That was progress back then. But I'm here to say, no, we don't need any punishment anymore. This isn't the Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, you have heard in the law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. That's the actual translation from the Greek. That's the sentence Gandhi read several times a day and decided, how can I practice that, and how can I apply it to the nations? And Dr. King said Gandhi is the first person in 2,000 years to take what people at most have put as a personal ethic and applied it to national and global ethics, so that Gandhi gets the British to leave India nonviolently. It's brilliant. And then Jesus goes on and says, you have heard it said in the law, love your countrymen and hate your enemies. But I say, love your enemies. And what's even more scandalous, he goes, then your sons and daughters of the God of universal nonviolent love, who lets the sun rise on the good and the bad and the rain to fall on the just and unjust. So he's commanding political nonviolence, but says the mystery of the holy of God is that God is totally nonviolent. Well, we don't want a nonviolent God. And we don't want to be nonviolent, because that would be the end of America. And yet that's the challenge, and that's what Gandhi and Dr. King have tried so hard to teach us. And we need more and more people to give our lives trying to teach nonviolence. That's what I'm trying to do with my work. Teach nonviolence, organize nonviolence, and practice nonviolence, and help us discover again the possibilities. Even to live nonviolence now as a way of life. That's our future.
I'm looking at you. You're a very youthful, handsome man. I kind of feel like we came of age within the same social moment in America, myself in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. I guess yourself in North Carolina by way of Duke. I grew up in a moment where the television screens were littered with cops and movies about World War II. All of our so-called social victories were seemingly won at the point of the spear or at the end of a bayonet, whether it was Bunker Hill or D-Day. How did you come to this understanding in your life living in a Cold War America? To me, it's almost amazing.
Well, I'm 61. I grew up in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, near the Outer Banks, where there was a police shooting just last week, as you know, of an unarmed black man. I came from a very politically aware family, and for some weird reason, I was a pretty pious kid. So I just found nature. I found God in nature, and I thought life was fantastic. But the Vietnam War is going on every day, and I'm watching the killings. I mean, why would you want to do that when life is so cool and you got the Beatles and everything? Mm-hmm. But then in 1967, we moved to Washington, D.C., and my father became the head of our family's newspaper publishing company. In 35 newspapers. He was suddenly also the head of the National Press Club.
Wow.
And overnight, we were in the thick of things. So we were all reading the newspapers, total news junkies. I'm 9 years old, totally politically aware of the Vietnam War and Dr. King and the Civil Rights. I had witnessed the Klan in North Carolina. Now I'm living in Washington, D.C. And then on April 4th, Martin Luther King is killed. And we were out that night, and the next morning, my mother came in at 5 a.m. in the morning, and she woke me up and said, "They killed Dr. King, you need to get out of bed." So I watched all the news, and my father that day took me downtown to see the curfew and the riots. I was destroyed by the death of Dr. King. I'm very weird that way. And then I was very aware of Bobby Kennedy. And then I was destroyed by the death of Dr. King. So what happened to me, Bill, and I grant this is weird because I was precocious or something, it was death that I was trying to come to grips with. Death. And I never did. I went into an existential crisis for 10 years trying to figure out death. And I thought, as a kid, our country clearly killed the two greatest people we've produced, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And I decided I didn't believe in God, and I was just going to try to make as much money and be as violent as I wanted. That didn't work. You know, it's an interesting experience because I just became very depressed, and there's no purpose to life. And then I thought, oh, that's baloney, because life is good. I believe in God. And then I thought, I want to give my whole life to God because I'm trying to deal with death. And then the second thing happened to me is I said I was going to become a pious priest. That was my plan, which didn't work. And I thought, well, before I enter the seminary, I'm going to see where Jesus lived. And this is the end of my story, Bill. I flew to Israel to hitchhike for 3 months through Israel to see where Jesus lived. Only the week I left, Israel invaded Lebanon, the summer war of 1982 against Lebanon, where the U.S. organized the killing of 60,000 people. All the Holy Land tours were canceled. I hitchhiked for 3 months, camped out illegally at the Sea of Galilee for 2 weeks, which we can't do anymore. And there, pondering the Sermon on the Mount, really for the first time, love your enemies, blessed are the peacemakers, I saw Israeli jets swoop down over the Sea of Galilee and drop a whole bunch of bombs 15 miles away, killing people in Lebanon, at the place where Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers and love your enemies. And I decided then and there that day that I would spend the rest of my life on the Sermon on the Mount. And here I am, 40 years later, still trying to do that. I don't claim to have done anything, but I do claim to be trying. Because I thought that day, as I said, I wanted to be a pious priest, but I thought, that's not what the guy wants. The guy wants, seek first the kingdom of God and God's justice, hunger and thirst for justice, blessed are the poor, love your enemies. This is serious political work. And he got killed, like Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy and Gandhi, my heroes. And I thought that's part of the job description. And that's when I met the Berrigans. And they're like, you know, if you're not getting arrested, don't talk to me, kid. So I got arrested, and now I have a problem with recidivism, and it's a long, sad story, Bill.
So this connection between spirituality and political action, it seems like they're one and the same. One makes a demand on the other.
Well, what's helped me is Gandhi and Dr. King's perspective of nonviolence. It's called a hermeneutic of nonviolence, that you see the entire world and your heart and your soul and the scriptures, everything through the lens of nonviolence. Nothing with violence works. We want to have nothing to do with violence. We don't want to kill. We want to work to stop the killing. But no, we want to be totally nonviolent and organize the world nonviolently. I think that means that you can't claim to be religious, spiritual, even on some kind of deeply human journey if you're not addressing the total destruction of the world or on the journey of nonviolence. So you can be a spiritual person but still have guns and killing people, or you can be silent in the face of war and nuclear weapons, then you're part of the problem. And the same with politics. If your politics don't deepen and help us all become human by really deepening us into spiritual practice of nonviolence, then I think we've missed the point. That's why Gandhi and Dr. King are the greatest teachers for me. Every church, every religion should be against all the structures of violence, because I'm convinced through my work at the Fellowship of Reconciliation that actually every religion is rooted in nonviolence. I think Judaism is about nonviolence, Islam is about nonviolence, Even Christianity, and dare I say Catholicism, is about nonviolence. Buddhism is all about nonviolence. But you know, Bill, it's so interesting. Nobody wants nonviolence, because I have been lecturing to lots of Buddhists in the last 20 years, and they all get mad at me too. They want to wage war and have nuclear weapons. And then I go and tell my friend, the great teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, and he goes, yeah, that's right. Buddhists are just into violence, as much into violence as everybody. So everybody's got to change. All of us religions are wrong, but all the politics are wrong. To be human is to be nonviolent. And then you discover, as you said, it's both a spiritual and a political path toward a future of peace, toward a disarmed world. We're going to go profoundly, interiorly into the nonviolence within and become people of nonviolence. So we're going to practice nonviolence toward ourselves and make peace with ourselves. And we want to make peace with every human being on the planet and be nonviolent toward every human being on the planet and spend our lives making a new world of nonviolence. Otherwise, what the heck are we doing? And when you frame it with the word nonviolence, I think it takes everything in, including race and gender, to the struggles for justice, to the question of, can I have all this money? Can I support the United States arsenal or threatening nuclear weapons, or sit back while they're destroying the planet? No, no, no. Nonviolence is a call to action. There's nothing passive with nonviolence. It's active love in the pursuit of our common humanity and oneness with creation. We're reconciling with everyone and resisting the structures of violence and practicing universal love, with the one catch that from now on, and I'll end with this, we will never again, Bill, support the taking of a single human life. People of nonviolence, we don't support killing anyone anymore. We can resolve our conflicts nonviolently, and we can spend those trillions spent on war in funding nonviolent conflict resolution around the planet and literally create the structures for a more nonviolent world. That's not a utopian, idealistic belief, practical, and that's what the UN people are saying.
One of the things that was absent from the last year's political debate, the old argument about guns and butter and the relationship between the two, that for every dollar spent on a nuclear weapon or a howitzer is really a dollar stolen from human welfare. And it feels like that's kind of absent from the current debate, but it's fundamental to it.
Well, of course it's absent from the debate, because the question of war is not mentioned at all. And nobody's talking about nuclear weapons, even though we're on the brink of nuclear war. You know, you can talk about anything in this country but war. I say that quite seriously. I've been told by the national media, we'd love to have you on, John, but no one against war is allowed to be on the national media. I got a letter from the great PBS guy, Bill Moyer, saying, I can't have you on my show because you're against war. That would be the end of PBS. And right, that's true. So there's no debate about that. And the thing is, we're spending all our money, vast majority of our money, trillions of dollars on preparations for mass murder, weapons of mass destruction. Biden's not doing anything about actually cutting the nuclear arsenal, cutting the military budget. In fact, we're on the verge of rebuilding another 2,000 kits, making new state-of-the-art nuclear weapons, which is totally not necessary to be getting rid of these. And we could save so much money. We have military bases in over 100 nations around the world. We have over 750 military bases around the planet. We could close so many of those. And all of that money could easily go to fix our schools, end hunger in the United States, childcare, development, appropriate employment for every human being on the planet, easily free healthcare for every human being on the planet, house all the homeless. But actually, that's just the tip of the iceberg with that money. We could easily end world hunger in 2 weeks. The United Nations has done all the math. What's missing is the political will. We need to make the connections between justice and the money that's going into war, and say we need to come up with a way, end warfare as a permanent way of life. You know, it's just about making the rich richer and these corporations richer and the oil companies. So we need to stop that and institutionalize nonviolent conflict resolution and put our money into real human needs. It just makes me think, though, like, you know, you go to Japan and they don't have any potholes, they have free health care. Why? Because they spent no money on the military since World War II.
Right.
So their country is state of the art. We can have that too, but small 1% of the 1% is making billions off of our addiction to war. And we go right along with it. So my message to activists, people who care, is start connecting the dots. You care about the earth, if you care against racism, if you care about the poor, you have to be against war and nuclear weapons. That's where the money is. And we need to transfer that money into a more just world. You cannot have justice and decency for every human being on the planet and trillions going for war and nuclear weapons at the same time. And that's the message of the prophets, Bill. That's in your own Hebrew Bible. I'm not making this up. It's not brain surgery. It's just common sense. Rich run the world. We've got to organize to get that money back and save our sisters and brothers in poverty.
The thought that just came at me was the demand that nonviolence makes on human creativity. Gandhi wasn't only, like this, as you say, the greatest theologian in history, but he was like brilliant in terms of his strategy and sensing weaknesses and finding political levers. And so when I look at this multi-trillion-dollar military-industrial complex, what is the creative approach to maybe finding the weak link in that chain?
Because the one thing about violence and war is there's nothing creative about it. You just shoot them, kill them, drop a bomb and vaporize Hiroshima or Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, or you put your knee on George Floyd. I mean, it's just stupid. That's why having guns just doesn't require any thinking. You know, it's mindlessness. Whereas nonviolence requires you got to think, you got to be mindful, because you're saying, I'm going to respond to the violence out there and the world through creative nonviolent action. I got to think what I'm going to do because I don't have a gun. And if you do that, you can disarm people. Violence doesn't work. So, you know, if you don't have a gun and someone's threatening you, you got to treat them like a human being, engage them and say, hey, don't hurt me, I'm a human being, and love them until they come to their senses. And I've tried that on a personal level. I love your idea. Nonviolence is infinitely creative, and that's what Gandhi insisted. And many of the writers about Gandhi have called him a social artist, because what he did in India, he's greater than Picasso. That's why you can look at Gandhi in so many ways. He was doing art. How do you mobilize an entire country with nothing? By the way, they didn't have the phone or fax or internet. He wakes everybody up to resist the British. And Gandhi says you need a symbol. So he spent a year meditating, and then he salts. So he marches to the beach. In the movie Gandhi, picks up the salt. And the whole country hears about it, and they all knew it was illegal, and that was the end of the British Empire. And so Dr. King with the bus boycott after Rosa Parks, and Jim Lawson with the lunch counters, and my friends Daniel and Philip Berrigan during the Vietnam War, they walked into the Catonsville draft office in Maryland, took out all the draft files, put them in the parking lot, and poured homemade napalm on the draft files and burned them in front of the TV cameras and faced 6 years in prison. And Dan's famous statement was, we're so sorry. We like to burn children with napalm like the rest of you, but we just burn paper with napalm, which I realized is that you see how crazy, and it woke up the country. And that's really what sparked the anti-war movement. So how do we do that? Creatively, a couple of things come to mind. I have this book, which I hope people get. You might like it too, Bill, called The Nonviolent Life. And I propose there that nonviolence requires 3 simultaneous things. You have to be really nonviolent to yourself, number one. At the same time, you have to be meticulously nonviolent toward every human being on the planet and the creatures and Mother Earth. And third, you have to have one foot in the global grassroots movement of nonviolence. So first creative response is to try to live nonviolence as a way of life. to do that for the rest of your life, to non-cooperate with violence everywhere you see it, and to be proactively supporting all movements towards a new nonviolent world. Second thing, in this country is so individualistic, and TV and entertainment and money, form communities of peace and nonviolence. Get with your local peace group, and LA needs more of them, Bill. And the third thing is creative public action. I think you always have to be involved in some nonviolent action. That's why I can't just talk about nonviolence. I'm smiling because I'm thinking of Cesar Chavez, who I knew well. I was with shortly before he died, and he was chastising me for writing too many books on nonviolence. I've written 40 books on nonviolence now. Sorry, Cesar. Nobody's got it. Anyway, he said to me, for the rest of your life, tell everybody that nonviolence, this is the way he said it, nonviolence requires public action, public action, public action. You have to engage in some public action for justice, disarmament, and creation if you want to be a person of nonviolence, because it means getting in the streets. So I encourage people to get involved. And how do we do that? I mean, what do you do about climate change or democracy or racism? We've got a lot good happening right now. Those Parkland kids after the massacre in Florida, how they organized, that was creative nonviolent action. The Women's March against Trump's inauguration, creative nonviolent action. Last year, the Black Lives Matter movement was pretty much meticulously nonviolent. 26 million people participated in it, way more than the civil rights movement, something Jim Lawson and I talk about. And then the growing environmental movement, which has to, that's how change happens. We all have to get involved. And I got with Jane Fonda and her Fire Drill Fridays movement, which you can look up. She's doing great work. And when the pandemic ends, we hope to be doing these public actions on Fridays around the country to insist that we have to stop digging up fossil fuels and really be more nonviolent to the earth. That's the creative response. You know, we need to come up with new things. And I urge you, for all of you in the churches and in your religious communities, use creative nonviolence there too. Go up to your ministers and rabbis and priests and start challenging them to preach and teach nonviolence. We need to stop the religious support of violence. Anyway, Bill, what do you think of all that?
I would like to just offer an idea for civil disarmament, voluntary civil disarmament, because we need like an Operation Plowshares where people can turn in their guns in exchange for health care credits, food stamps, tuition credits. It's just like a march to the sea. You just start and see what happens, because there's just too many friggin' guns everywhere. I mean, you can't look cross-eyed at somebody without fearing that they've got something in their pocket that could terminate your life. I don't know. That's like Operation Plowshares, civic disarmament. I haven't even heard that word, but I feel like it maybe might just catch fire. I don't know.
I love that, Bill. That's wonderful. My friend Shane Claiborne is doing that, and he's writing a book about it. And these brothers, I think they are in Colorado, and they drive around the country, and they have this horrible, ugly contraption, a welding machine. And I would be giving a speech, or Shane Claiborne, and you're supposed to show up and turn in your guns, and they're being disarmed and made into shovels and rakes. And they have done tens of thousands of weapons. But nobody's getting publicity about it. You can Google all of this. RedLetterChristians.org is a group, I think, promoting it. So that needs to happen. Every church and religious community in the country should be a place where you could turn in your guns and weapons. But you're right, we should make up, the government, if we were sane, would be offering all kinds of incentives to help us disarm, because it's not working. So many of the gun killings are accidental, where someone drinks or gets mad and then they shoot their partner or friend. All of that's, we've got to come up with a new way to create a nonviolent society. But meanwhile, there is the Plowshares movement, Bill, which I was part of, where people, like I did in 1993, we walk onto a military base with a hammer and a Bible, invoking the book of Isaiah. I walked up to a big, massive F-15 nuclear fighter bomber, as you do, which had nuclear weapons on it, and I pulled out my little hammer and I went once on the side of it. didn't even chip the paint, and for that action, I faced 20 years in prison. I did 9 months in a cell. As I said to the judge later, which I thought was funny, "Hey, Your Honor, I'm just doing what it says in the Bible. Is there a problem?" Isaiah said someday the people are going to come along and beat their swords into plowshares and study war no more. And I said, "Your Honor, I'm just following the commandment of Jesus, love your enemies, don't nuke them." And I said, "That's the original translation from the Greek." Didn't like that either. I'm trying to make you laugh, Bill.
It is funny. I love your story of the canoe versus the Trident submarine in the Thames or Groton, Connecticut. You know, I just see that. It's
there have been 100 plowshares, actually. A couple. I don't know. People need to know, and I hope you know about it. My friends, the group that won the Nobel Peace Prize 2017, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It's the most hopeful movement happening on the planet. They're organizing through the UN to outlaw nuclear weapons, and they've got 55 nations, and they're just going to chip away. These are the same people who got rid of landmines and cluster bombs. And Martin Sheen and I were invited they flew us to Oslo, Norway, to be the keynote speakers at the launch of this thing. I remember 10 or 15 years ago. And there's all these people, and Martin asked me to tell that story. And it's so ridiculous. And it just mobilized all the great people from around the planet to really work to get rid of nukes. But what do you do? This was my creative response. They're launching the 19th, like we need another Trident submarine, which has thousands worth of Hiroshimas on board. This was in July 1993. The 19th Trident submarine was being launched. It's outside of the Thames River on the border of Connecticut and Rhode Island. There's a bandstand with 10,000 Navy officials in white, and the vice president was there. They had a band. All of our friends were getting arrested at the front, but you couldn't see them, and the media was ignoring them. And me and 3 friends got a canoe. We were like the Marx Brothers taking on nuclear weapons. This is what I said in Oslo, and they just roared laughing. And we jumped into the Thames River. If you think about how it goes off of Long Island, because they launched the submarine because it's so deep. And then it's patrolling the planet, always on alert to blow up the planet. It's insanity. And meanwhile, that's $1 trillion we need for the poor. Well, anyway, what I never thought about, Bill, but I didn't realize when we were planning the canoe action, is that the Thames River moves really, really fast. There's the Atlantic Ocean right there. We got into the canoe, boom. Oh my God, the thing we were racing. Forget the Trident submarine. We were almost lost at sea. And just as we get into the Trident submarine, these cops on little speedboats come up and they're going, "Hey, you know, the river's closed. You can't be in here." We're going, "What? We can't hear you. No, you need to get out." "Oh, it's just a beautiful day." And they came along the side of us, and we stand up with a big banner, "Disarm the Trident." And now we're in front of the Trident submarine. There it was, looking right down at me. It was utterly over the end of the world. And the 10,000 men and women, the Navy guys with their wives, the band stops, and the cops grab us, and we're rocking in the canoe, and we all fall overboard, and they start arresting my buddies, and I start swimming toward the stands. And being a priest who has a gift of preaching, I'm in the water, and I'm making a speech to the crowd, and they're all leaning forward, and I'm going, "In the name of the God of peace, dismantle this evil, demonic weapon of war and mass destruction. We don't need these Trident submarines." I was just in the middle of my speech, and my hand was up, and the cop speedboat came by and grabbed me, and it was like a cartoon. I went flying up into the air, and he flung me way off onto the beach. And my friends and I landed on the beach, hysterically laughing. We shut down the whole launch of the Trident submarine, Bill. And I faced a year in prison for that and had a very serious 3-day trial. It's all very exciting. This is what I say. Nonviolence is very exciting.
Well, I'm often wondered when you spent, I guess it was 8 or 9 months in North Carolina and then the Connecticut experience, if you ever were feeling less confident or not so hopeful about the nonviolent method in the face of such just just like so overwhelming odds.
No, I don't have doubts about nonviolence or the God of peace. I think human beings were made nonviolently, that the baby is pure nonviolence. So we teach children to be violent, and we teach them that the world is about violence, and we train them to join the military, and God wants you to go and kill for America. It's all baloney. And I don't have a doubt about the methodology of nonviolence as the best way of social change, as Gandhi and Dr. King have showed. I'm sad and I grieve how so many people, and so many good people, clearly are not interested. We're so many indifferent to the world. We feel like, oh no, I don't want to get involved in controversy, so I'm not going to speak out against war or nuclear weapons. To me, they're the problem. That's what Gandhi and Dr. King said. And so I grieve over not only the insane violence of the world and the maintenance of these structures of violence and war and weapons, but the silence of good people, especially religious people, and how they continue to hurt and oppress so many activists who are working for positive change. I think to be a human being in such a world, in such a moment, is to be a nonviolent activist working for justice and disarmament. And the creatures and creation, if we want to have a future, if we want to leave a future to our, the next generations. So besides, and when I say all that, Bill, I mean, violence isn't any fun. And it's not good to be full of violence or anger or hatred. It doesn't work. And I'm tired of it. And I don't want to live like that. I want to be peaceful. And I want to be peaceful toward everybody. And I've met all the greatest people. And I found that you can do that. And you can be joyful even as you're doing brave, daring deeds.
I have been more in the theoretical sidelines of nonviolence. I have not been in a tent at the Occupy movement, but I've been thinking about this, and I've engaged people about nonviolence, and very often I get the reaction, well, it wouldn't have helped the Jews in the Holocaust. And then I had these interviews with a number of historians about abolition and the Civil War, and I said, well, do you think there was perhaps a nonviolent alternative in the 1860s that might have prevented the catastrophe of the American Civil War and freed the slaves? And I would just say this, that I think the Civil War set in motion a culture of violence and gun fetishization that we're still in the grip of. But, every time, I bring that up to people, they say, well, no, without the war, it would not have stopped the Holocaust. Blacks would not have been freed, from slavery. And so I never have a satisfying answer when I'm faced with that challenge.
I think there's always a nonviolent alternative. That nonviolence is actually infinitely creative because it's the way of God. There's always another nonviolent thing you can do for dialogue and treaty. There's a lot of money to be made in war. There's a lot of money for the white racists to be made in enslaving human beings. The British didn't have a civil war. They figured it out nonviolently through the Quakers, and it all happened because a bunch of Quaker women, they're the leaders of this in the late 1700s. So we didn't need the Civil War. If the white churches were totally racist and they totally rejected nonviolence. But this country was founded by violent Christians, all into colonialism, empire, racism, killing millions of indigenous people, waging war from the beginning. Violent revolution is very rare. It's amazing we've got a lineage of nonviolence at all. About World War II, World War II is about World War I. When World War I ended, we crushed the Germans, who have a particular thing about pride. I'm just saying, I could say it's a neutral thing. They're very proud people. We humiliated them. And in the 20s, that gave rise to Hitler and racism. You just study it, and that's how fascism is working in our country, too. And nobody resisted. Few people resisted nonviolently, and then it gets to a point where it's too late. That's what's happening in our country right now as fascism is rising. But, it all continues. We became Hitler to stop Hitler. What's interesting to me are the exceptions to all these stories, the communities of nonviolence that resisted slavery and the Civil War. And you see them in William Lloyd Garrison's friends who inspired Tolstoy. And then you see that in all kinds of people in Europe who were killed through nonviolent resistance to the Nazis, people like Franz Jägerstätter, or who weren't killed but resisted in Germany. And then there's others like André Trocmé in France who nonviolently, illegally sheltered thousands of German Jews in the south of France. They were creative. We need to hear more about that. And I'll end with, I did a book of all of, I call it Gandhi's greatest hits, which you might like. And I have letters in there that Gandhi wrote to Hitler and Gandhi's open letters to the German people saying, what you are doing is not nonviolence. Sitting back and being afraid and letting all this insanity happen is not nonviolent. Gandhi would be very pleased with Black Lives Matter, Parkland kids, the environmental students. You have to organize in the streets. That's why I wanted to say that again. And unless we do, Gandhi said, unless democracies move, he said this in the 30s, unless democracies move toward nonviolence and become nonviolent democracies, they have to turn towards fascism, which is what we saw under Trump and which is what's happening every day in this country. But we've got to organize, learn nonviolence, and teach it as a methodology of change.
One of the things that really interested me about your biography, and it's also history, is the story of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which I think can trace its origins to the YMCA in World War I, and it still exists today, and you were director of it. I think James Lawson was pivotal in that in the 50s as well, and the early 60s. I would like you to just expand or talk about that, because that's another strain that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century.
Its story has never been told, but the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which grew out of Europe during World War I, where several sides said they weren't going to fight anymore, began as a Christian movement. And then in the United States, it eventually developed into an interfaith movement. So, but Gandhi was a part of it in the 1910s. We had a magazine in the US called Fellowship, which basically out of print now. He used to write articles for it in the 1920s, and he was going to host the Fellowship of Reconciliation Convention in 1948. Later that year, he was killed at the beginning of the year. Dr. King was totally involved in FOR, and Dr. King used to sleep with a gun under his pillow in the first days of the boycott until the FOR people went down, Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley. Glenn was my friend, say, hey, nonviolence means you got to get rid of your guns, Martin. And then he became on the board, and everybody, the FOR is the most important and largest group of peace in modern history, and it's pretty much dead now. But you can look it up, the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Fellowship of Reconciliation USA. And what's interesting to me, Bill, is that we started all these different religious spin-offs. The Jewish Peace Fellowship is still active. Did you know there were 300 Jews in the United States who refused to join the US military and go off and fight the Nazis because of their belief in Jewish nonviolence? And they were all given life sentences in Colorado. Nobody knows the story. Hundreds of thousands of people did civil disobedience out of the FOR. It's led to the Muslim Peace Fellowship, Catholic Peace Fellowship, Buddhist Peace Fellowship. It's the largest mainstream teacher of nonviolence in the world. I wish it was continuing, but you know how groups move on and off. But I was there in the 90s, and it was a great experience with Jim Lawson and many other people.
Didn't the American Civil Liberties Union trace its origin to the FOR?
So all kinds of groups started because it changed so many people's lives, and then they went off and did new things, including Gandhi and Dr. King were influenced by FOR.
I listened to your podcast about Dorothy Day and her life in Greenwich Village during World War I, and John Reed and Eugene O'Neill. And, I was reminded of the movie Reds and the Provincetown Playhouse. I don't think people really realize today what fervent years those were, you know?
Well, she was just such a mythic figure, first of all. And there was a huge movement after the turn of the century against World War I, and that led to the suffragist movement as well. But all of that is left over from the abolitionist movement. You know, by the way, we didn't talk about Reconstruction. What did the Civil War, what did it do? It led to segregation and all the problems we still have today. But anyway, Dorothy was totally involved in so many great things in the 1910s. And it was mainly communists, but not like this was before Lenin even.
Yeah.
They were democratic socialists, and by the 50s they had to stop all of them, because that would mean that the military-industrial complex wouldn't run this country anymore. That's what they were working to change. They were really working to end war and to have rights for workers, and everybody had jobs, housing, education, food, and dignity. Dorothy split off from that and became a Catholic and a Christian and founded the Catholic worker movement and almost single-handedly changed the Catholic Church. She's the first Catholic in U.S. history to be against war. And she's a woman. Who does she think she is? And she's about to be canonized.
And she wrote in Hollywood, and she went to Mexico, and she interviewed Trotsky.
Yeah, she's a very cool person.
What a life.
She lived a long life, too. And so we got a lot of men, but, Dorothy's the great woman of modern history about nonviolence. I have podcasts about all of them that are free that your folks might be interested in.
Yeah, I'm going to just make a pitch for the John Deere podcast, because there's Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Franz, Jägerstätter,
Dr. King.
Gandhi, of course, King. And you got to check these out. This is the Mount Rushmore that we need carved. These folks... Yeah. It's such an awesome accomplishment in your life. I'm humbled by it. I've spent most of my years trying to get bit parts in movies that never get seen, or, get my next screenplay made. That's been my life. I sort of stumbled into this, when I wrote this screenplay actually I read David Halberstam's book, and I said, this is an incredible story. And yes, it's a story of Black empowerment, and it's a social justice story. But what occurred to me, and this is where, Lawson is so powerful to me, is it's a grand social experiment to see that if in a country drenched in violence, where the whole mythology of our society says that all of our liberties were won on a battlefield, whether it was Bunker Hill or the sands of Iwo Jima. I mean, I grew up with these movies, and Lawson comes back to Nashville after some time in India and elsewhere and says, I want to try this to see if it'll work in America. I felt like he was possessed of this idea that this nonviolent Gandhian, Jesus-inspired strategy was a force as powerful as the atomic bomb. And when I read that, it was just like, this is so radical in a way that no movies really get into this, except conspicuously the movie Gandhi.
Well, I encourage you to keep at it. And anything you can do to help me too, Bill, and or those listening with, it's beatitudecenter.org to spread my work. And also to, promote nonviolence in any way you can. That's what we need. Everybody doing this. We need films, we need books, we need people teaching it, we need the churches and religious communities preaching it. I myself am trying to get a movie about the Berrigans made. I'm Daniel Berrigan's literary executor. And there's so much there. And if you can help me, Bill, I'm not having any luck with Hollywood, but, Attenborough spent 20 years writing that script and 20 years raising money. He had no support from Hollywood, and he raised all the money himself. The making of that movie is as great as the movie it is. And I think it's the greatest script ever written, the greatest acting for the greatest man in modern history. It's an incredible accomplishment. It shows we can do this. There's no great movie about Dr. King. The movie Selma was good, but we need something much better.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do in my script, and I'm selling it always, is that you could cut to the lunch counters or the freedom rides, and those are compelling moments. But unless you see the discipline and the strategy that Lawson and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette, who I would love to speak to on my podcast, if you get into the discipline that it took for them to be prepared for that moment. They had to be no less organized than a military operation. Nonviolence requires the same discipline. And for me, I want you to comment on this, because to me, nonviolence is hard because violence exists in us all. My big joke is, whose ass do I have to kick to tell a story about nonviolence?
Well, there's so much to say. If you're asking about violence inside us,
yeah,
it doesn't work. I think we're all addicted to violence. And it's just the same as being, let's say, addicted to alcohol. You've got to do your work and join the 12 steps. And we go to a 12-step meeting of Violence Anonymous and say, I'm not going to be violent anymore. You need a community support. You turn to your higher power. And we're on a journey for the rest of our lives to be sober people of nonviolence. The same thing. And we'll never get perfectly nonviolent because we're so sick, especially Americans. All of us are sick. It's almost like we live in a zombie movie. You and I, first of all, we got to be doing our work every single day. So how do you do that? You have to take time for meditation. Every major peacemaker and figure in history of nonviolence did that. Gandhi spent 2 hours in silence every day. I went to where he did it in India with his grandson, Arun Gandhi. And by the way, Bill, he was a very busy guy. I would say Gandhi was busier than you. Just the reason we don't want to do it is because when you sit down to do your quiet time in the morning, which is what I urge people, all your junk comes up, all your rage, your anger, who you're still mad at, or your parents, and you got to keep letting go of that and forgiving everybody and letting the gift of peace come from the universe or the God of peace and breathing that in and returning to your core. We're constantly being disarmed every day of our lives. And then we live our day out of that. And then we work on who are the people who push all your buttons. That person, the most difficult person in your life, Bill, is your teacher of nonviolence. Because that person's exposing your violence. You owe them a lot. Now you get to go and work on that person and win them over through your creative nonviolence. Only you can figure out. You got to do your homework on it and plan it. And what are you going to do? And when you're driving, be really nonviolent. Or you're with a Trump person, how are you going to be really nonviolent? Or instead of sitting back and watching TV for the rest of your life, you're going to join a movement and get on the streets with people. Always going to do it as peacefully, as nonviolently as possible, as your spiritual practice. Because life is short, and we're headed toward, I believe, eternal life of nonviolence. And we want to get ready for it now. So we don't want to have to be embarrassed to do our work when we die, and we're with this infinitely loving, nonviolent God, and we're going, anyway, I won't even go there. Get with your homework now, put a program, do your inner work, and your public work will actually be better, Bill. The more we're doing our inner work, our public work and our teaching will be better. But whatever violence is pushing you, whether anger or impatience or whatever, we're not helping the world become more nonviolent by continuing our little bits of violence here or there. So we have to do our work. That's just a pep talk, Bill, to encourage you to keep at it.
Okay, well, it starts Sunday on Mother's Day with my Trumpist stepfather. I'm going to harness every little impulse of nonviolence and try to reach out to him and hope for the best. That's all I can say.
I wouldn't bring up anything political with him.
No.
It's not going to work. You don't need it. You just want to love him and give him gifts, have a beer with him. And you know a way out, Bill? Curiosity. Like, get him to really tell you his life story. And one day, as he becomes friends with you, you're like, what is my friend, my father-in-law really like? He's going to say to you, Bill, how did you get like this? And that's going to be your opening. But don't ever go there. You can't, with your families, it don't work. It doesn't work.
Right.
It really doesn't. And with Trump people, it doesn't. You need to put your energies and your organizing and your teaching and so forth. Keep doing that. But with your family, there's a different tactic. And it's just love. John Lewis told me that. He said, John, don't forget, all this nonviolence talk is about agape love. We're going to wear everybody down with our love. Okay, John, I'm going to work on it, I promise.
Yeah, what a great guy he was. I felt like, I'm just going to say this, when I was writing John Lewis, I didn't meet him. I'd read his great book, walking with the wind, not against the wind. And what I kind of came to, because ultimately, you know, when you write screenplays, you kind of drench yourself in the research, but then you take this imaginary leap and you just start seeing it, and these people start talking and behaving for you. And what I felt was that when he got his ass kicked, when he was pounded at Selma or in the bus depot in Montgomery, or on his journey of reconciliation, which we became the Freedom Rides, that when he got his punched in the face, that at those moments it didn't hurt. He must have felt totally close to God. It must have been like I guess that's the only way I could get to it, is like, oh, when this happens, it's just like, I'm there.
That's not true. Now, I have just recently published a long interview, which was actually filmed, that I did with John 30 years ago. You can, I don't know if it's on my website, but it's online. But anyway, I asked him all those questions, and I think he was always filled with God, but especially in those moments like in Soma. When you're doing civil disobedience, you're in your zone, your best behavior, you're totally mindful, you're got God, you're begging God to be with you. So he was that, but it hurt. And he had both, and he suffered a lot. And I since you brought that up, I'm going to talk about it for a second, because nobody talks about this in nonviolence, because you can't talk about it in white America. African Americans are talking about it because they're being hurt so much. But Dr. King talked about suffering every single day when he talked about nonviolence. But we're talking about active nonviolence. But we're not going to inflict suffering on others or kill people, but we are willing to accept suffering in the struggle for justice and peace, without a trace of the desire even to retaliate with further suffering. We don't even have a trace of the retaliation in us. That was John Lewis and Dr. King. They reached that level, and so did Gandhi, and that's what I want to do, and that's what you want to do. We are willing to suffer and give our lives to end the violence. And something happens when people see unarmed, innocent people suffering in a cause of justice. Scales fall from their eyes. And that's what happened, for example, at the Selma Bridge. When they see those unarmed people, John Lewis, get beaten up, it was shown on TV that night and was live on The Nation. They got the civil rights bill. It wakes people up. Suffering is a transformative way. We all need to think about that. How willing are we to work for peace and justice?
Nonviolence does not necessarily protect you from violence, I guess, is...
Well, in the short term, but in the long haul, it's the only thing that protects you.
John Deere, I want to thank you for this conversation. I can't wait to meet you in person. I want to go up to the Central Coast and go paddleboarding inside the estuary there in Morro Bay. It's one of the more beautiful places on earth. Now, you maintain the Beatitude Center in the Central Coast.
It's mainly an online event, a small nonprofit organization. I'm teaching nonviolence on Zooms almost every week for people around the world. And so I have my podcast and some blogs, and it's, again, beatitudecenter.org. And then my other website is johndeere.org with my writings and stuff. Normally I'm on the road speaking, but because of the pandemic, I'm not. Thank you very much for having me on, and I wish everybody all the best, and let's all stay nonviolent and practice nonviolence and work for a more nonviolent world.
Father John Deere, I want to thank you so much for this interaction. It's illuminating. Check out the books. You go on iBooks. There's quite a few. The podcast. It's a deep pool to swim in, and it's so interesting and it's so rewarding. So thank you so much again.
All right. All the best. Peace, everybody.
Peace.
Have me on again. I'll come back sometime.
Oh, well, definitely. You're on the calendar. Until next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean, yeah, you know, namashaloha.
You know.